Ok, allora, buonasera. Credo che possiamo iniziare con questa lezione di Vandana Shiva su suolo, beni comuni e futuro. Non c'è bisogno di presentare Vandana Shiva, dobbiamo solo ricordare che Vandana Shiva ha realizzato da poco, insieme a una commissione, un manifesto Terra Viva che è stato presentato anche e discusso nell'ambito di Expo poche settimane or sono, e che è, diciamo, il manifesto su cui sta montando una campagna, un lavoro appunto a livello internazionale. Quindi io darei subito la parola a Vandana, a cui prego di mettersi al podio e di fare il suo intervento, la sua lexio. Vedremo quanto, insomma, abbiamo un'ora e mezzo, un'ora e 20 minuti. Quando Vandana avrà finito la sua lexio potrà prendere anche delle domande dal pubblico e interloquire anche con voi.
Sure.
The floor is to you.
Thank you very much, Simone. It's a pleasure to be back in Florence for this new initiative of the new world that we must create together. No one excluded, no one left out. The Terra Viva was a result of a very beautiful collective process of drafting a manifesto for our times. It was also connected to the fact that 2015 has been the year of soil. And so, while drafting a manifesto on soil, we wanted to connect it to the challenges humanity faces. It was a commission from all over the world and a combined initiative of Navdanya International, as well as the region and Banca Ethica. Of course, we launched it right at the beginning of the Milan Expo. And since I've been back to the Milan Expo a number of times for various things, without being biased because we were part of the process, I have to say that Terra Viva brought a lot of content, a lot of fertile content, content that has a potential to keep growing and keep unfolding. And I think that's the kind of quality of thinking and action we need today. Because we've had this very, very separated world. And as we've said in Terra Viva, separation is the big disease. First, the false idea that we are separate from the earth. And all of the 250 years of the past, thinking of paradigms, whether it be in science, or it be in economics, or it be in politics, were all about human beings being separate. And if they were living with the awareness of interconnectedness, they were declared as primitive. Of course, no one can separate themselves from the earth and from nature, because if you were separate from the amazing cycle through which nature takes the carbon dioxide that we exhale, and through the photosynthesis of plants, converts it into oxygen, we wouldn't be alive, we wouldn't be breathing. So we are connected to the trees, and that's why in India, I'm sure many of you do yoga and do pranayama, and pranayama is just breathing in and breathing out with consciousness. And breathing in and breathing out is just the consciousness of the interlinkages we have to the larger world. If the trees weren't there, we wouldn't be there. They give us oxygen. If the rivers weren't there, we wouldn't have the water. If soil wasn't there, we wouldn't have food. Of course, I'm talking at a time where the big news stories of our times are, how will we grow food on Mars? And I keep saying, continue to take care of your soil on Earth, and you won't have to think of a science fiction film as the model of how to shape our future. Because the Earth gives us the possibility to live on the Earth. After all, this beautiful planet, Gaia, is the only one that has created conditions for life to emerge and human life to be part of the biosphere. So instead of recognizing this amazing abundance and the amazing laws that go with it, instead of recognizing that we are the soil, we are the earth, as we've written in Terra Viva, the word human comes from humus, which is the Latin for soil. And the Abrahamic traditions talk about Adam being the first human being. And that is derived from Adamus, which is the Hebrew word for soil. So it's so clear in all our stories of the human presence on earth, it is recognized we are the soil. And yet we pretend we are separate from it. And we pretend we can destroy it. And we pretend we can live without it. I think the kind of crisis we are in, and the crisis we are in is what Terra Viva tried to address, are a threefold crisis. There's an ecological crisis, and the ecological crisis is a combination of impacts we've had on the earth. I'm just looking for some water. If you'll excuse me a minute, I'll find a jug out there. So, what is the ecological crisis? The ecological crisis is not a fragmented crisis. It's not just a crisis of climate change and too many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's not just a problem of species disappearing at 1,000 times the natural rate. It's not just about our waters getting polluted or depleted. It's not just about the soil being desertified, degraded, cemented, as we've written in Terra Viva, and the authors of the section on the city and the countryside are also present here, Roberto and Ilaria. All of those are different symptoms of one crisis. And that crisis is of the human relationship to nature. And the crisis of the human relationship to nature is based first on this illusion that we are separate from nature, we are masters, we are conquerors. And I am particularly happy about the present Pope's encyclical, the Laudato Si, because at one level he's correcting 500 years of violence, 500 years of blunders, 250 years of thinking of humans as separate from the earth. You know, the fact that this encyclical comes from the same institution where in 1493, another encyclical was written, which was called the Papal Bull of 1493. After Columbus arrived in America, he actually thought he was coming to India because, you know, the Europeans were looking for spices and textiles, and because those were the very profitable trades of that time. And if you look at history books, 1 sack of pepper used to be exchanged in Europe for 1 sack of gold. That's how precious the spices were, the pepper, the cardamom. So basically, Columbus thought he was getting a different route to India, and he lands there and he thinks he has arrived in India, so he calls the native people Indians. And so all the indigenous tribes of the Americas are called Indians. And they complain a lot about this. You know, we are called Indians. I said, don't complain. Columbus's blunder made us one humanity. We're all Indians. So that after Columbus's arrival, 1492, the Intercetra encyclical was written. And it was basically empowering the Spanish king and queen to overthrow all barbaric nations, all barbarians. Now, part of what has happened with Terra Viva is it has had a very natural growth. Just like fertile seed, you sow a seed, it gives you a plant, maybe 100 seeds, maybe 1,000 seeds, maybe 1,000,000 seeds, and then those seeds get distributed, and each of those 1,000 will give you another 1,000. And Terra Viva is like a seed. It's a seed for a fertile imagination in our time of despair, of hopelessness, of closure, of thinking we cannot make a difference in these times. The powers of destruction are too big. The powers of control are too powerful. Terra Viva, on the basis of what's happening around us, recognizes that there is destruction and there is despair. And look at the continuing flux of refugees, which are the end result of a process of destruction. But there's also not just the possibility, but our responsibility. And that's why the Novo Modo theme, in my view, is so important. Responsibility for all to shape the future. So one of the things that's happened with Terra Viva, there's been a natural multiplication in a very, very interesting way. It's been translated. It's been translated in Hindi, and it's circulating in India. It's been translated into Spanish, into French. And I got an invitation from Sardinia. They have made a Terra Viva Sardinia, which is basically a report of what's happening to Sardinia today, which is being treated like a dump yard of all the nuclear waste, toxic waste, being treated as an empty land, as at the time of colonialism, to be grabbed. But then they've shaped their own Terra Viva. What future do they want? What will be the kind of work the young people will do? And while we were launching the Terra Viva Sardinia, I remember the local hosts, they were about mayors of 10 small towns who were adopting it as their planning document. And they were talking about how they've always been referred to as the barbarians. Yeah? That Sardinians are like barbarians. And so I said, if being a barbarian means having democracy, if being a barbarian means taking care of your land and being proud of your culture, being a barbarian means making sure your children know your language, making sure that the beautiful soil that has been inherited carries on for the future, knowing what your food culture is and keeping that alive, if that's what being barbarian is, I say being truly human is to be barbaric. Not in terms of trying to conquer, dominate, exterminate others, but realizing that we are one with the earth. And that's part of the problem of the ecological crisis, which assumed we are separate from the earth. And then not only are we separate, we are masters and conquerors. And the encyclical says it very clearly. We've got to stop thinking of ourselves as masters and conquerors of the earth. And St. Francis is cited about our sister Mother Earth crying out because her soils, her water, air are all being damaged. And the fact that in an encyclical the word Mother Earth has entered is for me like a breath of fresh air. Because I come from a culture where we've always seen the earth as sacred. She has 1,000 names. Vasundhara, Bhumi, Prithvi. In India, everything has 1,000 names. Lalita Sahasranam. Lalita is one name of divinity in feminine form. Lalita Sahasranam is a poem to she who plays with 1,000 names. It's just a list of 1,000 names, all the facets of creation, all the different ways in which creation works. And the idea of a living earth, a Mother Earth, is something I've grown up with, and even as a scientist, it was not a problem for me. But when in it was 2009 when the climate summit in Copenhagen was subverted, and Navdanya International had taken a climate and food security manifesto and released it there, but towards the end, President Obama went, met the Chinese, Indians, Brazilians, and together they said, no, we don't have to have legally binding obligations for climate change. We'll have voluntary commitments. And they literally tried to kill the legally binding UN framework on climate change, which is the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Just like there is the UN Treaty on the Convention on Biological Diversity. So, President Evo Morales of Bolivia, the governments were still in the hall. President Bush is holding a press conference saying, we've come to an agreement, it's all over. And the whole hall of UN representatives and officials and heads of state gets up and said, but we are still negotiating. How can you announce it's over? And that's the time Evo Morales said, I am going to go back to Bolivia and call a summit of the people. And out of it grew what is called the Draft Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. We have a UN declaration on human rights after the wars and after all the brutality of the wars. After that, the United Nations was formed, and the United Nations, one of the first things it did was create the UN Human Rights Declaration. And we feel it is now time to recognize the rights of Mother Earth. So there is this Universal Declaration. If you Google you'll be able to find it. It's a very, very powerful text. I've been part of the core group that was involved in drafting it. But when this movement had to be adopted in the United States, they all said, no. We can't use the word Mother Earth. We have to use the word nature. I said, the problem with nature is you can still declare nature as dead. When the earth is a mother, not only is she alive, but you are dependent on her for your life. That's where the encyclical is so powerful. It has allowed the word Mother Earth to come to the lips of the West, which means undoing the damages of 500 years of calling people who recognized that we are dependent on a living earth, barbarians to be conquered, and 250 years of a mechanistic worldview which declared that nature is dead. The ecological crisis is a combination of those two errors, one 500 years old, one 250 years old, and I would add a third error, a third mistake, which is trying to call corporate dictatorship over our economy free trade. It's only free for the corporations, but for ordinary people, it is creating unfreedom. I can tell you what it has done to India. Since 1995, when the World Trade Organization Treaty came into force, we have lost 300,000 farmers to suicide. Millions have been displaced, but 300,000 have committed suicide because agriculture has been reduced to corporations selling patented seed, collecting royalties, selling chemicals, and trading globally. Now, that process inevitably means you spend more and more on producing whatever you produce, whether it's milk or it's maize or it's tomatoes, the input costs get higher and higher and higher. And meantime, because these five corporations who are trading have a monopoly in buying, they depress the prices. So in Europe, your prices of milk are falling to a level below the cost of production, and you have dumping all the time. In India, which has the largest dairy in the world, but they're all a woman with one cow or one buffalo or two goats, but it's large production with a very, very small decentralized foundation, and it's always been viable. But today it's being made unviable because of this global interaction of trade. I call it deregulated commerce. It's not free trade. It is deregulated commerce. And as if the destruction isn't enough, as if 300,000 farmers dying isn't enough, as if every second Indian child being pushed to hunger of a severe kind, so severe that the heights of our children are falling. Half of Indian babies, they're becoming dwarfs. Their body is shrinking. Their birth weight is too low. Half of India. All because food has been made into a commodity. It's not that we can't produce enough food for all people. The work we do in Navdanya shows that when farmers have their own seed, when they do ecological agriculture, when they shape their own fair markets and get a fair price for what they produce, we produce much more food. We definitely produce a lot more nutrition and a lot more quality. And the farmers' income goes up tenfold. Tenfold. So the globalized system is crushing the farmer between rising costs of production and falling prices. And it's not that the falling prices paid to the farmer translate into low costs for consumers. Today, food is a commodity, it's speculated on. The price at which people buy, I mean, the pulses, the lentils in India right now are selling at 200 rupees a kilo. People can't afford it. All because of this speculation, all because of this international trade. So how do we get out of it? And that's what Terra Viva tries to create a framework for. It's a framework for a transition. It's a framework for a transition out of a system that is unraveling and is in collapse. But even while it's collapsing, that system wants to extend its life by taking more from the earth and taking more from society. In fact, the word austerity only means we'll keep ourselves afloat by crushing you. I followed very closely what structural adjustment translated into for India. In India, structural adjustment was all the laws we had been put into place after independence, all the laws we had put into place to get rid of imperial injustice. They're all dismantled and brought back to the time of the empire. One law was a universal food security law, that everyone should have access to affordable food, and if the state has to intervene in this, the state has a duty. That universal right was dismantled. Another very, very important part of our systems was the state has a duty to ensure the farmer gets a fair price for procurement. That was dismantled. So the poor can't get food and the farmer can't sell what they're growing at a proper price. Farmers' grain is rotting and the poor are going hungry. And when our Supreme Court ruled, a case was taken to the court about so many people being hungry while grain was rotting, the government said, we cannot intervene because it will disturb the market. But the market is not an anonymous process. A market is market players. Market players are corporations. And the idea that you can't disturb the market is another way of saying we will not regulate commerce, we will not regulate greed, we will not regulate predation, we will not regulate exploitation. So in Terra Viva, and this was to me, very beautiful, we split into 3 groups. And each of the 3 groups did their own drafting of their section on economy, on democracy, on food, agriculture, soil. And all 3 groups, quite independently, came up with an analysis of the linear extractive system that takes resources from the earth, that takes the wealth of society, and piles it in the hands of 1%. Which is why you get a 1% economy, which is why you get inequality. It takes the power of the people, the power of the local commune, the power of the village, the power of the region, the power of a country, the sovereign powers of a country, and puts them in the hands of corporations. So you destroy democracy and you destroy sovereignty at the same time. One of the most important clauses in these new free trade agreements is these investor-state dispute settlement systems. And investors are basically corporations. Investor-state dispute is corporations claiming the right to sue governments who work in the public interest. So, for example, you're very, very privileged. In Italy, you have a universal health system. I know because I had very serious problems, and at the end of it, I thought, my God, all these days in hospital, I don't know how much they're going to rip me off. Nothing. Even as a foreigner, I had to pay nothing. Now, universal health care as a fundamental right can be challenged by those who see in health huge profits and huge business. The insurance companies, the pharmaceutical industry, the big chains of hospitals in America. And they can sue Italy and say, if your health was privatized, we'd have made $5 trillion a year. And by keeping your health as a universal right, you have deprived us of $5 trillion profits. So how is this dispute settled? If they sue Italy within the national constitution, in a national court, they will lose, because your constitution gives you this right. Your courts recognize the right, so they would lose. So the investor-state dispute settlement is they create secret tribunals outside the country. And who sits on these tribunals? Are they public judges? No. Are they elected? No. They are trade economists who have worked for the same companies before. And there are only two outcomes of a dispute. If they sue Italy and say, you owe us $5 trillion, either you allow us to take over your healthcare and make as much money as we want to, or you compensate us $5 trillion. Those are the only two options in those disputes. So these companies have sued countries that had tobacco hazards. And they said the size is too big. The lettering is too big. It's interfering in our rights. After the Fukushima disaster, Germany had to go nuclear-free because of the big mobilizations. A Swedish company, Vattenfall, sued them $40 billion. We'd have made so much money. Now we won't, so you owe it to us. So it's an absolutely insane system. It's first insane because it's violating every constitutional framework we've created to protect the rights of people and create obligations of the state. It's insane because it's taking real people with real rights and trashing them and saying the corporation has rights. And it's also insane because it is taking the commons that support our lives, our soil, our water, our seeds, our biodiversity, our knowledge, our education, our health, and turning them into a commodity to be bought and sold. And whoever makes the highest profits turns out to be the winner, with no obligation, no responsibility. Which again makes me compliment Novo Modo for the recognition of everyone's responsibility, because we have a strange system just now of corporate rights with no responsibility. And people having all the responsibility, losing all their rights. This is the democratic crisis that's being created. And when you think of the rights of Mother Earth, it starts to make a shift. The rights of Mother Earth is basically saying to humanity, if the Earth supports you and she has rights, then you have a responsibility and a duty to care for her. So out of her rights flow our duties. Out of our duties flow our rights. So if I have a duty to protect water as a commons, I have a right to that water. If I have a duty to protect the seeds and biodiversity, out of that duty flows the right to have free exchange of seeds and saving of seeds. And that's why we have built the seed freedom movement globally. Because in the last round of free trade, Monsanto put into the intellectual property treaty a clause for patenting life, which is so wrong because life is not an invention. Machines are invented. Artifacts are invented. Life is a continuity of the creation of the earth and human communities in constant evolution. You don't bring a seed out of nowhere. It was either a wild plant, domesticated, cultivated, diversified, like the rice in India from one grass, 200,000 varieties created. No farmer said, I invented this. They bred it, they evolved it, they selected it, they changed it, but they worked as co-creators with the creative processes of nature. The idea of inventing a seed is such a false idea. Because what actually happens with a GMO, and I want to congratulate Italy for being among the European countries that exercised the ban on GMOs on the deadline of 3rd of October. A GMO is merely taking existing seed and shooting an unrelated gene from an unrelated organism, and along with it, adding antibiotic resistance markers and viral promoters. Now, the antibiotic resistance marker doesn't create the seed. The Bt toxin doesn't create a seed. The viral promoter doesn't create a seed. It contaminates the seed. Because now you have viruses and bacteria that don't belong to the plant. And these raise issues of safety, issues which are constantly being crushed. But there's another reason why this idea of owning seed as intellectual property and private property with the false claim of invention is so wrong. Because we need biodiversity. And for biodiversity to continue to evolve, we need a lot of exchange. So the word Navdanya, I must tell you two stories about it. I'd started to save seeds after 1987 when I attended a meeting where the corporations who had sold chemicals were now saying, we have to do genetic engineering in order to take a patent, in order to collect royalties, because that's where the future profits will lie. Forcing every farmer to buy seed every season. They'd calculated it. Till then, seed was not anyone's private property in that way. And so they had to create laws that made it illegal for farmers to save and exchange seed. But if farmers don't save and exchange seed, the first thing that happens is diversity disappears, and we need that for ecological stability. We also need it for health. There's so much discussion on the Mediterranean diet. You wouldn't have a Mediterranean diet if there wasn't a Mediterranean model of diversity in agriculture. You can't create a Mediterranean diet out of monocultures of GM corn and soya. You need diversity on the farm to be able to have the diversity in your plate. And that's what makes for the healthy diet, which now is recognized all over as the reason why the Mediterranean people are healthier than others who don't have that kind of diversity in their diet. But when this duty to save seeds and exchange seeds is interfered with, seed starts to fail. And we are witnessing that right now, because seed is adapted to that side of the mountain with that kind of temperature, a soil with this kind of fertility, that level of moisture. And the corporations, when they're that concentrated, they're in a rush to sell the same seed everywhere. In India, they brought in the GM seed for cotton, which is where the suicide started. Right now, as I talk to you, 80% of the GMO BT cotton in Punjab has been destroyed by something called the white fly. A white fly never attacked cotton in India before, and the white fly has not attacked the organic cotton. The organic cotton is standing safe and good. But the BT cotton, which was supposed to control pests, has been devastated. So for 2 weeks, there were protests. Our team went. If you go to Facebook, if you go to reports on the Seed Freedom website, you will find lots of reports on the farmers' protests. And we started a campaign, Farmers' Lives Matter. Suddenly, about 5-6 days ago, some pages of the sacred texts of the Sikhs were found desacralized. And now the government is giving these stories of, oh, it must be the Pakistanis. Oh, it must be some foreign enemy of India. But all of this, and 2 farmers were shot in this process. But it took me back to 1984, when I was studying the Green Revolution, and the Punjab, as the land of the Green Revolution, had erupted in very, very severe violence. With that violence, the original part of it was actually farmers' protests. They were blocking the trains, they were blocking the roads, they were blocking the government. And on 4th of June, the army was sent. It was sent into the sacred temple of the Golden Temple in Amritsar. And then onwards, the story was about religion and extremism and terrorism. And suddenly, farmers had disappeared. That's why I decided to do the analysis and write a book called The Violence of the Green Revolution. Exactly the same is happening now, 30 years later. Farmers are protesting because the seeds are failing them. They're in debt. They're spraying poison 14 times to try and control the pests. And out of the blue, you suddenly get a problem of religion being manufactured. And a farmer said this: I think this is just a diversionary tactic to shift attention from the farmers' issue in Punjab. Why do I give this detail? Because in Terra Viva, we've gone to the roots of 2 major areas and crises and conflicts today that are being presented as purely religious conflict. One is Syria, and the other is Nigeria and Boko Haram. 2009, that entire area, all of Africa, all of the Middle East, had a very, very extended and very severe drought. But this was in addition to decades of overexploitation of the land and the water because of non-sustainable models of agriculture. Chemical farming requires 10 times more water to produce the same amount of food because it's so chemical dependent. You need a lot of irrigation, it destroys the soil's capacity to hold water, so you have to constantly irrigate. As a result of which, very sustainable water systems are rendered unsustainable. I watched it in Punjab. Punjab means the land of 5 rivers. Their groundwater is going, their rivers are dying. Lake Chad was one of the biggest lakes of Africa. In 1966, its area was 22,772 square kilometers, the water. In 1973, it had dropped to 15,400. 94, it had dropped to 1,700. It's now less than 5% of what it used to be. Can you imagine? 9 million people around Lake Chad in 4 countries derive their livelihoods from this water, which brought life to the pastures, to the animals, to the agricultural crops. And as the lake shrunk and the drought of 2009 intensified, there was conflicts over water between pastoralists and settled agriculturists. The global media spin became Muslims versus Christians. So happens the pastoralists are Muslim and the settled agriculturists are Christians. But they weren't fighting because they were Muslim and Christian. They were fighting because their life support system was disappearing. Exactly the same happened with Syria. If you look at the literature, they talk about, oh, the conflicts began in 2011. No, 2009, they had a severe drought, 80% of the livestock and crops wiped out. The farmers marched to the cities in protest. And just like in Punjab, instead of solving it as a farmer's issue, army is sent, Assad started to send out his armies. The rebels started to get armed, the rest of the world armed them more. And now you don't even know what's really going on in Syria. Who's who, who's doing what, Putin is there, ISIS is there. Most of the Syrians are out of Syria as refugees, marching, marching, marching. And you remember the little baby who was washed ashore, Ayan. To me, that image is the image of our times. So over the years, 2 things I have realized. One, that as an economic model that is totally out of alignment with the Earth's laws, and is therefore non-sustainable, and is out of alignment with human rights and democracy, and therefore creates inequality, that this economic model must create diversions so people don't organize to change it. So one diversion is the way every time people seek equality and justice, some action is taken to make it look like, to make people fight each other on religious lines. If you can't find Christians versus Muslims, you make the Muslims Shia versus Sunni. And then you take another sect and another sect and another sect, and you can carry forever. But there's another level at which something is feeding into this. And I've written about it in my book, Earth Democracy. Because basically what you have is an economic model, and you have representative democracy where you elect your leaders, and then you have cultures in pluralism, in diversity. But when your economic model is hijacked by global corporations through free trade, through WTO, through TTIP. Not only do they hijack the economy, they also hijack democracy. Your leaders aren't your leaders anymore. It doesn't matter whom you elect. They determine what they'll do. So it's like a genetic modification of politics. And the mutation is of the people, by the people, for the people as a democratic expression mutates into of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations. And the financial institutions were also corporations. So representative democracy ends up not representing people under this corporate hijack. And it starts to represent the interests of financial institutions, the interests of corporations, which is why the whole issue of austerity, make the people pay, enclose the commons, privatize public goods. And quite clearly, in such a system, if you are citizens of Florence and you want to decide the future of Florence, you want to decide whether there'll be that super fast underground train or not. You want to decide whether your museums will be run as public institutions or private corporations. You want to have a role in all of this. But when these decisions get globalized, and of course corporations are looking at everything, what can we privatize? Where can we make money? What can we control? Then local representatives also start losing their powers. But they still have to win elections. So representative democracy must, by its very nature, under the stresses of an inequitable, exploitative, globalized economy, it must, by its very nature, start to divide people for votes. Elections become times for creating fear among the population about every other. Anyone who's different. And in Canada, they just had an election. And there, the Prime Minister who just lost, Stephen Harper, he had made his big power through the tar sands and the oil industry. That is where his clout was. But at election time, because he wanted people not to focus on his corporate friends, he started to target one woman who was wearing a niqab. One woman. And she was a Canadian citizen, and she had won a court decision to take her citizenship pledge wearing the niqab. He made that the election issue, thinking he would make people become afraid of Muslims. It actually flipped. It went the wrong way. Everyone said, the courts have said it's fine. Who are you to say it's not all right? And why are you focusing on one woman? The woman herself said, Mr. Harper, you've got this problem, you've got this problem, you've got unemployment problem, you've got ecological problems, you've got the pipelines to deal with. Why are you focusing on my niqab? He's just lost his elections. But he might have won with the niqab as a diversion from economic affairs. So divide and rule along religious lines, ethnic lines, racial lines, linguistic lines, ends up being the currency for electoral processes. So from the political side, you get a reinforcement of the culture of fear, hate, separation. From the economic side, you get that. And the two start to play together to create what I call negative economies, democracies that are no more true democracies, and even more negative cultures. Why do I use the term negative culture? Because a culture is a grounding. A culture is a sense of who am I? And a cultural sense of who am I comes from the sense of place. I belong to Tuscany. I belong to Florence. I belong to the earth. I am an earth citizen. That is where identity gets created. Positive identity is always geared inwards, flowing outwards. Negative identities, which are also a mutation, don't have any insight. You don't have a food culture, everyone's drinking Coke and eating McDonald's. So what food identity do you have? Everyone's a consumer in a global market of monocultures. One of the things that globalization and this economy assaults is values. I've been in debates where they've actually said, we cannot consider values and other irrelevant considerations. So human values of justice, human values of care, human values of equality are all turned into irrelevant considerations. So when values go, you don't have a positive definition of what you're about. All you're left with is politicians telling you, oh, you know why you're having less jobs? Those immigrants. You know why things are going wrong? Those colored people. You know what the problem is? Those women in niqabs. And this then becomes what I call a negative identity. You are defined by what you are not, rather than by what you are. And it has been fed. There's intellectual work that's gone into it. At the time when President Bush was invading Iraq, one of his think tanks, Samuel Huntington, put out a book called Clash of Civilizations, which, at the one hand, laid it all out as, you know, the Crusades once again. But worse, there's a sentence in that book where Samuel Huntington says, I can only know who I am if I know who I hate. So not only is he saying if I know who I'm not, but he's saying who I hate. Now tell me, anyone in this room, is that the sense of self you have? Where you figure out, and I hate so-and-so. And then you know who you are. This is a message of insanity. It's a message of irresponsibility. It is, of course, a message of spreading the virus of hate. And so I'll come back to the dependence on the tree and our breathing. So when we say soham, and you do the pranayam, soham basically means simply, you are, therefore I am. A totally different sense of how we identify ourselves. One, in an interconnected world, interconnected with the earth, with all her vibrance and all her abundance, interconnected with not just our immediate family and community, but the entire humanity. And the other, where nature has to be annihilated, diversity has to be exterminated, the planet has to be controlled, owned, privatized, and you have to treat everyone else in the human species as an enemy who's out to get you. That is the option we have for the future. Which road we take? Do we take the road of division, separation, hate, fear, destruction, inequality? Or will we play an active role in shaping the road towards justice, equality, peace, sustainability, harmony, and respect for all diversity in the larger recognition of our unity as one humanity and our unity as one community of Earth citizens on one planet. And I think all of you are here because your choice is the choice for one planet and one humanity. And I know with the wonderful people who are here, who've organized Novo Modo, that this is the road here in Tuscany you will all walk, and the other road, you will put up a sign saying, dead end, don't go this way. Thank you.
Grazie infinite a Vandana. Abbiamo tempo per un po' di domande, se qualcuno vuole farle, perché fino alle 18:40 c'è l'ultima sessione di Novo Modo di oggi. Qualcuno vuole intervenire, fare una domanda, fare una considerazione? So che dopo questa relazione è difficile, però uno per volta.
So may I just
Of course.
Suggest, it's a discussion we were having together, the groups that shape Terra Viva, the region, Simone, you go with the Banca Etica, and the Navdanya International team. In many places, the Terra Viva has become a framework and a platform from where people are doing their local regional planning, a transition. This is how we want to see democracy to function. These are the rights of the people. These are the distributions of power and authority and responsibility. This is the way we want to see the economy, because the 1% economy is dead end. So what is the economy we shape? How would young people shape an economy? And what's the new agriculture? Where does it have a role? Both for creating opportunities for the young, but also good food, solving climate problems, addressing the problem of unemployment. And there will be a group created to take this process further. So I would suggest to all of you who are interested to keep in touch with Maria Grazia, with Simone, to ensure that you can participate, to make a Tuscan Terra Viva.
Ok?
Ok?
Qualcuno? Allora, se nessuno vuole parlare, io ringrazio di nuovo
Thank you so much.
Vandana Shiva, penso lo possiamo fare tutti con un applauso, e iniziamo fra poco l'ultima sessione. Thank you. Dieci minuti e iniziamo l'ultima sessione della giornata di oggi.